Thank you, Fred, and ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to be back here again with many of you who've been here before and many new faces I see. I'm going to be talking today about a topic in epistemology, somewhat technical. I hope to make it interesting to you, but it is of great interest to me, and so they indulged me by allowing me to speak on my specialty. The topic is the perception of causality. When we perceive the world around us, when we perceive the environment through our senses, what we perceive is a world of things, of tables and chairs, walls and doors, people, cars, food, all the rest of the so-called furniture of Earth. And each of the things that we see, hear, feel, taste, or touch stands out as something definite against the background of all the other things that we perceive. And philosophical discussions of perception, including my own in a book called The Evidence of the Senses, tend to focus on the perception of more or less static objects and the perceptible qualities of those objects, the shape, the color, the sound, the tone of a sound, and so forth. But we also, of course, perceive actions. Here we're looking at the starting line of a bicycle race. Nothing is moving, and then they're off. And of course, when you think about it, most of what we perceive are things moving somehow. It's very rare that we see a totally static scene. Obviously, the ability to detect action and motion, change of any kind in our environment is crucial to survival for any animal that has the ability for conscious perceptual awareness. And also for any animal that, since animals move around their environment, the ability to perceive their own actions and integrate their own actions with what's happening in the environment is also crucial. You just have to look at a cheetah chasing its prey. It is obviously governing its own action, the direction and speed of its running with the direction and speed of its prey. A particularly interesting example that psychologists have studied is diving birds. This is a gannet diving. I believe it's off the coast of Scotland. It's a combined series of shots of the gannet as it dives into the water. And what the bird has to do is solve an optimization problem in guiding its own motion. If it folds its wings too late, it will break them with the impact of the water. If it folds its wings too early, it will lose its guidance. So you can see it as it's plunging. First it goes into the jet fighter formation and then becomes a narrow stick entering the water to spear the fish. That's all happening within a second, let us say, from what we're watching here. So obviously the ability to perceive action and to perceptually guide our own actions is a highly developed capacity in all animals, including, of course, human beings. So a theory of perception has to deal with the perception of action as well as the perception of objects and their properties. From the time of the ancient Greeks, philosophers have debated the question of whether our senses are reliable. Do they provide accurate information about the things in our environment? And the stock example, a stock issue arises over the phenomenon of perceptual illusions, so-called, such as the bent stick in water, or the parallel lines that seem to converge into the distance thanks to the optical properties of space and of our eyes. But there are also illusions of motion as well. I don't know if you're at the right distance to see this, but if you fixate on the cross in the middle, you will soon begin to see a green dot circling, going around in circles. There is no green dot up there. There's just a series of red dots flashing in sequence. So there's a question of how we deal with illusions. That's one of the main issues, one of the issues in perceptual theory. But there's a lot more than just answering those kinds of questions. The study of perception has to analyze what are the units of perceiving. In the case of actions, would be what is a unit action? We see a stream of things happening, but how are they segmented in the way that things like this are clearly segmented as entities to your gaze. And we need to explain what it is that we can discriminate in actions. In the case of physical motion, obviously velocity is one, direction is one, but there are many others for the different kinds of change and the different sense modalities. Now, perceiving, so that is the topic, one topic that makes the perception of action interesting to a philosopher, to an epistemologist. But there's also another issue or set of issues for which the perception of action is very important, and that is the question, do we perceive causality? I'll finally get this illusion out of your eyes. Much of our knowledge of the world is about causal relationships that govern the way things behave in the world. We rely on assumptions and generalizations about the causal behavior of things literally every waking moment. And if you're dreaming, even your dreams have some weirdly, but only slightly unreal causal properties. Okay, I mean, just a simple example. You are all sitting in chairs, I think. Yes. Except for the gentleman in back. And you're counting on the fact that these are rigid objects that will continue to support your weight. They will not collapse, explode, or start biting you. You probably weren't thinking about that before I mentioned it, but that assumption is that behavior of chairs is something you had to learn, and you have counted on it every day, most days of your life, unless there are any days you've spent on your feet entirely. Obviously, most of science is the systematic study of causal relationships as well. So the question is, how do we acquire this knowledge? We hold it in the form of generalizations, like the one I just mentioned, but how do we validate those generalizations? Well, one answer would be we perceive causality, at least in some instances. We perceive things acting as they must because of the causal power or the causal nature, the causal connection between one event and another event, or between an entity and the way it acts. And from those perceptions, we draw general conclusions, and then we can go on to identify causal connections about things that we cannot perceive, such as nuclear reactions. Well, this is a question that, so the question is, can we perceive causality? And that is this is the second aspect of perceiving actions that I'm interested in talking about and thinking about. In regard to induction, this issue is tied up with what's called the problem of induction. Induction is the logical process of, let me move on here. The root process of induction is the process of generalizing from what we have observed about a certain group or set of things that have something in common, and generalizing that what we observe about them is true of all the members of that group or set of all that kind. We observe, we test the melting point of copper. We find out that it's 1,083 degrees centigrade. And we generalize that that's a melting point of copper per se. All copper everywhere will melt at that temperature, assuming the conditions are comparable to the one we did the test on. All people are mortal. How do we know that? Well, we observed a lot of people, but we haven't observed any future people. In all these cases, in both cases, and in the many other ones that we have, we infer, generalize from a sample to a whole population, to use the language of statistics, from some members of a class to all members of a class, from some S, observing that some S are P, to the conclusion all S are P. And here's the problem. When we generalize, we seem to be going beyond our evidence by the very definition of statement of what we're doing. Our conclusion covers things that we have not observed. If they're future events, future objects. We can't observe them yet, obviously. So what justifies us in doing this? What's our basis? Now, you can see that it's a serious problem, because if we can't rely on induction to draw general conclusions, such as all men are mortal, or chairs support the weight of a normal human being, or copper melts at its 1,083 degrees centigrade, if we can't support those generalizations, then we cannot engage in the other main logical type of inference, deduction, which is taking a general statement and drawing from it, applying it to a particular case or subclass, like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so Socrates is mortal. Actually, for us, he's now in the sample class. I think at the time this hoary old syllogism was invented, he might not have been. I can't remember exactly when that came up. Okay. With that, let me move on to the skeptical challenge. It was mounted by David Hume. Hume was not the first to mount it. In fact, I discovered when I was looking into the history of Islamic philosophy after 9/11 that essentially all of Hume's arguments and positions were anticipated by an Islamic philosopher, a famous one, writing, I think, in the 10th century, 11th century. But in any case, Hume is the arch skeptic, and here's how he proceeded. Hume argued that there are no necessary connections among events. In his words, all events seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another, but we can never observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. So we have no rational justification for generalizing beyond the range of our immediate perceptual experience. The fact that we've seen the sun rise every day up to this point gives us no rational basis for assuming it will rise tomorrow. The rising of the sun after the falling of the sun at night is the two separate events. One's always followed the other. Maybe it'll go on. The fact that bread has nourished us, to take another of Hume's examples, in the past is no guarantee that it will continue to do so in the future. We have no guarantee that it will not be toxic the next time we swallow it, or rigid and unswallowable. The regularities that we observe, in effect, on Hume's view, amount to a kind of metaphysical coincidence, that things just seem to keep happening in the same sequence, like drawing a series of aces from a deck. So that's Hume's position. Those are his conclusions. The question is why? Why did he say that? Well, his main argument, one further point about his conclusions. Because he doesn't think that causal necessity exists out in the world, that there are literally causal connections between one event and another, or between a thing and what it does. He says, well, where do we get this impression, the strong impression we have that when we observe one billiard ball, for example, hitting another, that the second one had to move off, that it was forced or compelled to move off by the impact of the first ball? He says, well, it's not justified by anything we can see in reality, so it must be imposed on what we perceive by a mental habit, an association. In his words, after a repetition of similar instances, the mind is carried by habit upon the appearance of one event to expect its usual attendant and to believe it will exist. This connection, therefore, which we feel in the mind, is the sentiment or impression from which we form the idea of power or necessary connection. So it's a subjective layer that's imposed on what we actually observe. So back to my question, what are his reasons for this position? Well, his main argument was simply to ask us to observe very carefully what we observe in perception. Imagine, says Hume, that you had never seen water before. Could you tell, just by looking at the water, observing its fluid and transparent character, that you could not breathe under it? That it would suffocate you if you held your head down? No, he says. How would you Where would that idea come from? The water is one thing. Suffocating is another thing. You can't deduce the one from the other. So the first time that you saw water, you wouldn't know that. Or again, if you were seeing fire for the first time, all you had available to your perceptual, to your senses, is the visible color and the flame. Could you tell that it would burn you if you put your hand in? No, he says. The cause and the effect are just distinct things. Well, very well, you might say, okay, but once I do observe what happens, then I can generalize. I can see that they're connected. Once I see the one, then the other, and maybe a couple repetitions. I see the connection as a result of multiple occasions of observing the behavior. So once I put my hand in the flame, I won't do it again. That would be typical one-time toddler learning because it hurt. But still, Hume says, okay, that's what we do, but can you actually see the connection? You see the flickering yellow flame of the fire. You feel the pain when you put your hand in it. Do you, on top of that, see a connection? Like a little between the flame and the burn, the pain? No. You just see what's there. You see the flame, you feel the heat, you feel the pain. You observe one billiard ball colliding with another. You see the motion of the first ball, the point of contact, and the second ball moving off. What you see is two motions. One follows the other. Is there some necessity you see? No, again, he says. So he says the mind can never possibly find the effect in the supposed cause, for the effect is totally different from the cause, and consequently can never be discovered in it. Motion in the second billiard ball is a quite distinct event from motion in the first. Now, underlying this argument of Hume's, this is as far as he went in the argument, but if you look more closely at his assumptions, you see that there is actually a philosophical assumption at work behind this, and I want to mention it briefly because it's important for our different understanding of cause and effect. And that assumption is called sensationalism. Hume starts with the assumption that what we are given in sense perception are sensations. Sensations are essentially momentary, isolated awarenesses of individual sensory qualities. You see a point of light, you hear a tone, you feel a little taste of salt on your tongue. Okay, close your eyes. It's like, imagine you're in an isolation chamber, and someone is every once in a while flashing a little light, or doing one of those little meditation bells, bong, and that's all you're aware of. Those would be sensations. Sensationalism is the doctrine that is the starting point of all awareness, and that our perception of objects as entities, our perception of a table as such, or a person, or our observation of, say, an automobile collision, and all of these things are constructed from a series of intrinsically isolated sensations that are put together by some mental process of association. That's why Hume casts his question about seeing necessary connections in the form, do we have a sensation of necessary connection? And he says no. And on that assumption, that's the only possible answer you could give. I mean, we simply do not have retinal or other receptors in our sense modalities for picking up necessity on top of picking up wavelength or sound wavelength or whatever. Okay, now, this is not the view of objectivism. Certainly, it's not my view. It's not true. So I want to move on now and talk about what I think is the better approach and the beginnings of an answer to this question about perceiving actions and their causes. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of depth. I've written a book about it called The Evidence of the Senses, and the second chapter is a long investigation of this doctrine of sensationalism. Excuse me. But the point is that the basic level that we're given in awareness, in perceptual awareness, in sensory perception, is the perceptual level in which we do see things as entities. Visually, we see figures standing out against a ground with an integrated set of properties. We see continuous processes. We see not just a flash of a 1 billiard ball moving and then a flash of another one, but we see a ball rolling along, hitting the other one, and the other one moving off. Okay, we see that as an entire unit. And indeed, for adults, certainly, we do not, and in normal context, cannot experience sensations as such. You have to go into a psych lab or something, or an isolation chamber, as I was mentioning before, and impoverish the conditions of sensory stimulation to the point where that's all we can do. Like you sit in a lab and you stare at a screen, or in your optometrist's office, and you're asked to identify, you're just shown little flashes of light or something. That's a sensation. But that's not the way we function. And apparently the best evidence that I've found is that children don't start out that way either. I think Ayn Rand had the idea, which was quite common in psychology at the time that she was writing, that for the child, the world is this blooming, buzzing confusion of sort of sensory qualities. That's a famous phrase from William James. But apparently that's not true, that children have a high degree of object integration, essentially from the go. It's loose, it's imprecise, they have a lot of sharpening up to do, but it's not literally sensational. But be that as it may, we don't perceive that way. So my definition, let me just see here. The definition that I developed in my book is that perception is the direct awareness of discriminated entities. It's essentially discriminating things from their surrounding as entities, discriminated entities by means of energy absorption at the sense receptors. The latter part is necessary to distinguish perception from conceptual knowledge, which also allows us to, at a higher level, discriminate entities from other entities. Okay, now of course we do perceive attributes and actions of things as well. We're aware of qualities in perception. How could we not be? We couldn't perceive a thing if we couldn't perceive any of its attributes. The way it stands out visually, the table stands out visually against the background of the carpet is that there are differences, qualitative differences in color, texture, and there's a shape to it. Those are attributes. But the point is we're not aware of attributes as isolated atoms that we then put together into the perception of an entity. No, we perceive them as attributes of this thing. We perceive the entity as such, and attributes as qualities, features like color and shape, as attributes of the thing. Okay? When we see an apple, we don't see just the shape isolated from the entity, nor just a patch of color. What we see are apples. That is, the actual thing with its color, its shape, standing out against, in this case, the background of leaves on the apple tree. This is the basis for the law of identity, that things are, everything is something, and that something is its nature. It is what it is. Now, of course, we also perceive the motions, actions of entities, the way they move and change. And in that respect, too, perception differs from sensation. The sensation, because it's a momentary experience, change at that level of awareness is really just the substitution of one quality with another. You're looking at a red patch and then it's replaced in the psych lab by a blue patch. Okay, you notice the change. That's the level of events at the sensory level. But perceptually, we don't perceive motions and actions in terms of isolated snapshots. We see continuous processes that, yes, we can segment into parts, stages of the action. And how we do that is one of the interesting questions that as I mentioned before. But we always do perceive actions as actions of things that are acting. It's an action performed by something. There can't be a motion without a moving object. Now, notice that I want to emphasize here that I'm speaking about direct perceptual awareness, not perceptual judgments. And this distinction turns out to be very important in philosophical theory here, because there's and also in psychological research, because people don't make this distinction, and they, as a result, they make all kinds of unfounded claims. A perception, when think of the case of a hunter stalking a deer, okay, observing the deer as it moves across through the woodland. Okay, that's an example of perceiving a process, perceiving an entity moving. Now, of course, the hunter is going to identify it as a deer, either explicitly in telling his buddy, hey, I see a deer, or at least subconsciously, he recognizes it as a deer, which is why he's prepared to shoot at it. And in the same way, we as human beings, especially as adult human beings, are always conceptualizing what we see, at least implicitly, so that we recognize things as instances of certain types. That's a table. David is speaking. The room is cool. Okay? Table, speaking, cool. These are abstract concepts that we apply to the particular things that we observe. And these are called perceptual judgments. This is a table, or in the case of an action here, the car is coming fast. But what we actually see is the table itself. What we actually hear is the car's motion. Okay? The table is it's this particular concrete specific table in this room, not the whole class of tables. And similarly with the car, and similarly with speaking, what you hear is not speaking as such when you say David is speaking. What you hear is a particular stream of sounds coming from this direction. So perception is not abstract. And this is why it can be the foundation of all of the rest of our abstract knowledge, from the earliest concepts we form for tables, for warmth or whatever, all the way up to advanced scientific concepts for things that we cannot perceive but infer their existence from what we can perceive. And on that basis now, I want to move on to talk about really the foundational point that we have to have as background before we can look more specifically at any issues of perceiving causality. And that is the law of causality. If you're looking at your outline, I'm going to pass over, I'm sorry. I'm going to pass over the segment, point B on the outline, the event view of causality and the regularity theory. I'll be happy to comment on that in the question period or possibly tomorrow. But I want to focus our attention now on what's called the law of causality. And that law, I think the best formulation of it is that every event has a cause and that the same cause has the same effect. Okay. The first part says that events and actions do not occur randomly. the occurrence of an event and the particular nature of that event depend on something that causes it, whatever that might be. And secondly, the law of causality says that the same cause has the same effect. There is an actual connection such that once we have discovered the factor responsible for a certain effect, that factor will always, in the same circumstances, continue to have that effect. So if we know that the law is true, we can answer Hume quite easily. We might even agree with him. I'm not necessarily saying this, but for the sake of argument, let's suppose we agree with Hume that we don't literally perceive causality, even with the richer notion of perception that I've outlined. I see the fire, I feel the pain, I don't literally perceive some relation of necessity over and above those. But I can generalize because the law of causality. Once I know that it's the flame that burned me, I can generalize that the same cause will have the same effect. So Hume will now ask the obvious question. What justification do you have for believing in the law of causality? How could we validate the law? And his main argument is that you can't justify it by inductive reasoning because that would be circular. If we try to the law of causality is a fully abstract statement. It applies to everything that exists, past, present, or future. And every action, every type of entity, it's fully general. How would we support that generalization? I mean, if you think fire burns is a generalization that's in trouble epistemologically, this is way, way up there. I mean, if you're trying to argue, well, this flame burned me and that flame burned me, so flames burn, okay, that's one thing. And then every morning the sun has arisen, so the sun always rises, that's another causal connection. And every egg that I've dropped is broken, so there's another causal connection. So I guess everything's causally connected. The same effect will always have. Hume will turn around and say, wait a minute, every one of your individual generalizations is dependent on the law of causality, and then you're putting all those generalizations together to have a higher level generalization about all the possible actions in the world. You have taken out a huge cognitive loan in going beyond any possible actual perceptual evidence that you've had. So how do you justify that? And most philosophers have said that you can't, and they have not paid any more attention to the law of causality. But in the Aristotelian and Objectivist framework and tradition, we do. We think it's very important. It's actually axiomatic, and I want to just outline why that is the case. First of all, to say that the first part of the law, as we saw, says that all actions have causes. To say that an action has a cause is to say that it's produced by something, that it is a dependent phenomenon. It's not a self-sufficient existent in the way that a thing or an entity is. And that's precisely what our perceptual experience tells us about entities and their actions. There are no actions without an acting thing. Actions in that sense, like qualities, depend on, they exist only as features of an entity. That's the first level of dependence. And that's why we can be sure that every event has a cause, because events are not self-subsistent existing things. Secondly, or building on that, if actions depend on the entities that act, then they have to depend on the identity of the thing. Why? Because the thing just is its identity. There's no gap between a thing and what it is. A thing is what it is. It is literally just its own nature. If it's for example, to take our stock example, if it is the heat of the flame that causes the pain, as anyone under the age of 5 has long since discovered, not the color, not the shape, but the heat of the flame, the temperature. That temperature is part of the identity of the flame. The flame actually is an interesting kind of example for our issue, because it's perceived as visually in object terms, even though it is a process. But it has the color effect, makes it look like a thing. But it is an entity. It is a unit that we discriminate, and its thermal properties are a feature of, let's say, the burning candle or the burning stove. So that means that the same entity in the same conditions, if its nature has not changed, will have to act in the same way. Because if the action depends on the attribute of the thing, and the attribute hasn't changed, then what depends on that attribute won't be different. The essence of causality is dependence on the nature of the things that act. Now, of course, most of the events that we use as examples, such as the billiard ball collision, involve more than one entity. And so we say we take the motion of one, and then the motion of the other begins. But what's happening here is two billiard balls. These are balls of a certain kind. What happens because of their rigidity, and as we now know, the momentum, the mass times the velocity of the ball, which scientists have discovered is a quantity conserved, essentially in this isolated context, we can treat it as a conservation momentum issue. But what we observe, we don't observe all that perceptually, but what we do observe is the fact that the rigidity of the cue ball and of the object ball is what makes the motion of the first lead to the motion of the second. If we replace the object ball with a painted Easter egg, the result would be very different. If we replaced it with a piece of high-powered explosive that was shaped like a billiard ball, the effect, once again, would be very different. So it is even in this case of one event seeming to cause another event with no perceptible connection, we do perceive the rigidity and the speed of the objects, and those, in fact, are what make the event happen the way it does. So I want to end with what I think is the best single statement of this point and of the argument. It's not really an argument, by the way, what I was just laying out. Go back to the slide. This is not really an argument. It's because I'm just pointing to something that's implicit in the law of identity and the nature of what we perceptually grasp. It's just putting things together, guiding us through the articulation of what we can observe directly. And a very, very good philosopher named H.W.B. Joseph, Oxford professor in the early part of the 20th century, wrote a book called the Introduction to Logic, in which he has a chapter on the presuppositions of induction, from which this passage is taken. If a thing A, under condition C, produces a change X in a subject S, remember, this is a philosopher speaking, the way in which it acts must be regarded as a partial expression of what it is. It could only act differently if it were different. To say that the same thing acting on the same thing under the same conditions might yet produce a different effect is to say that a thing need not be what it is. But this is in flat conflict with the law of identity. A thing, to be at all, must be something and can only be what it is. To assert a causal connection between A and X implies that A, the object, acts as it does because A is what it is, because in fact it is A. So long, therefore, as it is A, it must act thus, and to assert that it may otherwise I skipped a passage in the slide because it wouldn't fit, but I'm going to read it anyway. So long as it, therefore, as it is A, it must act thus. In short, the law of causality is the law of identity applied to action. Yeah, I don't know if this is the first statement of that point that Ayn Rand also invokes, but it is, I think it is a very powerful statement of it. And it essentially encapsulates the background of causality, the very fundamental level at which we can be certain that the world is governed by causality. Now, tomorrow I'm going to move on to talk about some more specific issues in identifying causal relationships and look more closely at the specific issue, can we perceive, and what would that mean? But for now, I will stop, and do we have any time for questions? Okay. Now, T-Bar, you got to follow the rules. There are rules. Okay. Thank you. Oh, these are, wow. Can I have another hour? Yes. Yes. Okay, I'm going to deal with one quickly. It's, I think, the last one in the series. Are there causal illusions? I'm going to actually talk a bit about that next time, so let me hold off on that one. There were a couple questions on sensationalism. Let me deal with those. Right, I'm not sure what that is. Okay. One question here is sensationalism should also disassociate attributes from the object. Comment, please. If I don't, whoever's question this was, if I don't answer it, raise your hand and I'll try to get a little clearer about what the question is. But sensationalism does isolate the attributes from the object cognitively, epistemologically. You can be a sensationalist and not believe that, and still believe that the world consists of entities out there with their attributes, exactly as I said. The argument would still be, we don't see them that way. All we're given, literally, in terms of our awareness, is these isolated attributes. And so, yes, that is a dissociation. A related question is, don't we sometimes, under poor light, at a distance, through fog or whatever, have to consciously assemble the perception of an object from sense data? Yes. I talk about several examples in my book. A good example would be, think of it in dim light. You're walking along and you see a shape, but you can't really make it out very distinctly. Is it a person? Is it a car? Is it a big rock? And you're sometimes not even sure where how to break it up into separate objects. I've sometimes had the experience driving at night on a highway, especially one, the high speed but sort of curvy, of seeing lights come around the corner toward me, and they look to my vision as if they're in my lane, coming at me, because I can't see the curve of the road. And that's not actually a straightforward example. That's it's an example of having to think, what is the entity and where is it? But maybe a clear example would be, I know there's something, two motorcycles, right? Or a motorcycle coming toward me. I don't know if it's actually a motorcycle or a one-eyed monster. And if it's a one-eyed monster, I don't know which light is out. So I can't make out an entity, even, the information is just too fragmentary. So I have to slow down. I'm sure many of you could think of better examples. Let me move on and take a couple more. How is the law of causality applied to the existence of the universe? It isn't. The universe is everything that exists. Causality is a feature of things that exist. So the universe is not an event for which we have to provide a notion of a cause, and it's not literally a thing. We can refer to it as the totality of things. But in that sense, it has not come into existence in some way that requires us to find a cause of bringing it into existence. It's reality, it's there. Causality, like time and space and all the other really fundamental phenomena that we identify about our world, are features that we presuppose the existence of things. Okay, how did Hume survive after reaching his alleged insights? He actually addresses this at length. And he says, okay, in my study, I have these skeptical thoughts. I'm following out a process of reasoning. I see no way around my arguments. But when I leave the study, I go about business like an ordinary person. I rely on the habits that have been instilled in me, just as they've been instilled in you by this psychological bent we have to assemble things. And hey, it sort of works. So he was actually, he was at one level quite charming in the way he did it. At another level, he was like Ellsworth Toohey. He was he was being a charming destroyer. In effect, in creating this dichotomy between what our minds tell us and the way we need to act in the world. Right? And if you accept that dichotomy, then you've suddenly rendered reason, all right, at best, a sometimes occasional useful tool, but you got to rely more on custom and your psychological habits. Okay, I better leave it there. There are a couple more, but I know we're at the end of our time. So if I didn't get your question, I'd be happy to speak afterwards.